Hi everyone and welcome to this session. This session is entitled Gender Pay and the Financial Cost of Being Female. My name is Nancy Roberts and I'm the founder of Umbrella, which is a diversity and inclusion business where we use data analytics to help companies close diversity gaps and improve inclusion. I'm going to talk a lot today about data because that I think is the most important tool we have in tackling some of these inequalities, but I will caveat it with a couple of things. Firstly, to say most of the data I'm using is from the UK because that's where my business is based and I work primarily with UK businesses, but many of these issues are not unique to the UK. And where appropriate, I've tried to include data from other countries as well, but given the constraints of time, we're going to focus a lot on the UK data. I'm also going to caveat it with, in terms of talking about gender pay, we do talk about gender as a binary male-female. The reason for that being that that's how most countries who collect this kind of data manage it at a governmental level. So in order to have meaningful benchmarks, we need to work within that binary. Okay, let's get started. So because I'm a data nerd, here's a little bit about me in 4 stats. I'm a female founder of a startup business. Statistically, in the UK, this means I can expect to receive less than 2% of the funding that male founders receive. For this reason, I haven't actually gone after funding. But what I want you to note about this is that if men are getting 98 pence in every pound of investment in startups and women are getting less than 2 pence, there's a real problem there because female-founded businesses actually statistically have a better return on investment than male-founded businesses. So this is an area where there's obviously something going on that's not just about the numbers. By the nature of running a technology startup, I'm a woman in tech. There's lots of different statistics about the gender balance in tech, but the most recent one I could find suggests that women are outnumbered by 2 to 1. I'm an MBA graduate, and when I studied on my MBA program, there were 5 men for every 1 woman on that course. And, you know, through the course of all of these experiences, I've decided that getting this fixed is more important than getting mad, although getting mad is important too, because we need to know what's going on here and we need to challenge it. So through my company, we've helped organisations close their gender pay gaps, in some cases by as much as 25% in 1 year. So we're trying to make a real quantifiable impact to women's working lives. The reality is that being a woman costs money. Throughout the course of our lives, the majority of women will earn less than men. Women also, particularly in the UK and the US, have a longer retirement. We live longer than men, meaning that our savings and our retirement pots have to last us longer. So let's look a little bit about what this means and the practical realities of being a working woman. And the reality is that statistically, women are going to face barriers in the workplace that men don't face. And I think we need to be aware of those because knowledge is power. So let's look at your career path as a working woman. Here's a few little metaphors, or as I call them, euphemisms, for areas where, as a woman, your career might hit some roadblocks. So firstly, the sticky floor. We find that typically women find it harder to rise above the low-paid jobs. And if you look at the UK gender pay data, you'll see that women tend to be overrepresented in the lowest pay quartile compared to men. In terms of the overall workforce, there's slightly more women than men in the UK. It's about 52–48%, but that proportion is not reflected in the pay data. So the higher paid roles are dominated by men, the lower paid roles dominated by women, and that's the sticky floor. We get stuck in those lower paid roles. The broken rung is a metaphor for women's difficulties in reaching management roles. So there's a big drop off of women in the workforce when you move from being a kind of supervisor or an individual contributor into a manager or senior manager. And this is referred to as the broken rung. The glass ceiling is the absence of women in boardroom roles. So this idea that women can reach so high in an organisation, but at the very, very top, there's a ceiling and all the men are above us looking down. And the glass cliff is perhaps something relevant to the world at the moment, which is this notion that the research shows us that if a company is in financial trouble or some kind of major trouble, that female CEOs get more attractive at that point. So, you know, we like to get a woman in to clear up the mess that the men have made. What's interesting about this is that those female CEOs are more likely to be fired, even if they successfully turn the company around, than their male counterparts. And you can see this often in public life. I mean, if you're in the UK, when Theresa May took over the Conservative Party leadership, it felt very much like a glass cliff moment. It was a kind of poison chalice for her, because there was such a lot of chaos following Brexit and all the political machinations of that. So we find these female leaders getting appointed when times are tough. And let's not forget the emotional labour of women in the workplace. So we know from the research that women are much more likely to do a lot of that emotional labour, whether that's organising something for people's birthdays, whether it's tidying up the communal kitchen, whether it's taking notes in meetings or being expected to take notes in meetings. Women will tend to be more expected to do that and more likely to fill those gaps than men. So let's get into talking about the gender pay gap. There's a lot of stuff on the internet suggesting the gender pay gap isn't real, and there's a lot of myths and misuse of statistics around this. The gender pay gap refers to the difference in average pay between men and women, and it's real. According to the World Economic Forum, it's going to take 250 years to close the global gender pay gap at the current rate of progress. So whilst it's moving in the right direction, it's really not going fast enough. So what is it that causes a gender pay gap? Well, the first and main thing is pay inequality. And that's the notion that men and women doing the same job might not be paid at the same rate. Now, in the UK, the US, and probably many other countries, this is actually illegal. But you know what? So is burglary, and it still happens. And pay inequality still happens as well, because there's a lot of ways to justify a pay difference. People will talk about, oh, well, this man has more experience, he has a bigger network, those types of things. And that makes it very possible for people to disguise that they're paying men and women at a different rate for the same work. There's also an obvious issue around the lack of women in senior roles. So again, if we look at the makeup of organisations, typically there are fewer women in the more senior roles, and that's largely about a lack of flexibility. If women have caring responsibilities, and we'll come on to why that falls more on women than men, they want some flexibility around how they work, even if they're in a senior role. But many organisations have resisted this, and it will be very interesting to see as the kind of world rebuilds post-COVID whether that continues to be the case. So a lot of the sort of stuff out there which says there is no gender pay gap will say women have chosen not to go into senior roles, women have chosen to stay at home with their children. I would argue that's not a choice freely made. Often, because the gender pay gap starts almost from graduation, often if a couple have children, the man is already earning more, so he's more likely to be the one that says he'll continue to work for the benefit of the family finances. Now, is that a choice, or is it a kind of Hobson's choice? And of course, many women would love to work while they raise their children, but the lack of flexibility just doesn't allow for that in many organisations. We're expected to be very present. And finally, there's this notion of occupational segregation, which is this idea that women's work is systematically undervalued, women's work in inverted commas. So things like caring professions, being carers for the elderly or for people with disabilities, things like hospitality and tourism. You get a lot of women working in these occupations, and as a society, we tend to devalue those occupations and overvalue the perhaps more white-collar occupations. And of course, there's a motherhood penalty. There's very, very strong data about the fact that having a child or children is going to affect your lifetime earnings, no matter what decisions you make about your work. So even if you go back to work, you'll face a penalty financially. So let's get a bit deeper into looking at some data around this. This is a chart which is drawn from OECD data, which looks at gender pay gaps across the world. And as you can see here, very, very high pay gaps in South Korea and Japan, much, much lower in Italy and Greece, the UK and the US sitting around the middle there. And I'd strongly recommend going to look into the OECD data for your region if it's not represented in this chart. But as you can see, this is a couple of years old now, but the gender pay gap in the UK at the time was about 16%. It's now thought to be around 13%, but because of the suspension of the legislation last year, which meant that companies didn't have to report in the UK, we can't be absolutely sure about that because the data we have lags behind where we are right now. And three important percentages that I think really tell the story. The gender pay gap for full-time employees in the UK is roughly 7.4%, according to the most recent data. What that means is if you're a woman and you're working full-time, whether that's after having children or you've chosen not to have children or before you have children, you're still likely to experience a gender pay gap, even if you're working full-time. If you include part-time workers, that goes up to 15.5%. So that's all of those women who have taken time out to raise their children or to do something for themselves and want to go back to the workplace part-time. Part-time workers, even if they're doing the same role, tend to be paid less than full-time workers, even when you pro-rata out the hours that they work. And some recent data in the UK suggested that 12% of mothers that were interviewed in a particular survey, which was quite large, I think it was several thousand respondents, reported that they believed their pregnancy was instrumental in them losing their job. So either they felt there was a sort of positive discrimination where they were being gently forced out of the workplace by not being offered opportunities, or they were first in the line for redundancies when that came around. So if you've got pregnant or had a child, there is a real potential impact on your ability to retain a role. And here's a little bit about just how that having a child affects your pay in different countries across the world. So what you see here is the light blue line is what happens to men when they have a child. And as you'll see in Denmark, that's flat. In Germany, it's more or less flat. In other countries, it bobs up and down a little bit. But what's interesting for us in this talk is the dark blue line, which looks at the impact of having a child on women's pay. So as you can see, if you look at Sweden, which is in the middle top, there's a huge dip for women when they have their first child. And they then, 10 years after that, have still not got back to parity with men. So even when those children are at school, and that those women may well be going back to work full time, they're still struggling to get to pay parity. And you can see in the US, there's a drop and not much of a climb back up. In the UK, similarly. In Austria, there's a similar dip of a big drop and then a bit of a gradual climb back up. So the sort of flow of this through your career varies region by region, but in all cases, having a child will cause your salary to drop. And aside from having children, we know that the gender pay gap exists for women in other ways as well. There's some research from the Chartered Institute of Management who produce a lot of data around this, that the difference in base salaries of male and female chief executives is 11.6%. So that's a gender pay gap of 11.6% for women who are running exactly the same type of companies as men. So big corporate global organizations in the FTSE 100 index. And when you include bonuses, that gap gets even higher. So the gap rises to about 36% when bonuses are included, and even higher, up to 75% when long-term incentives plans are factored in. So even if people's salary is the same, there are lots of opportunities for men to earn more than women have the opportunity to earn. And staying with the FTSE 100, the long and short story of the FTSE 100, if you want to be the CEO of a FTSE 100 company, it would be more advisable to be called Steve or Dave than to be a woman. There are, I think, 7 men called Steve running FTSE 100 companies, 6 men called Dave running FTSE 100 companies. There are only 7 women across that 100 companies. So, you know, better off being Steve or Dave than being any woman at all. And of course, we know that COVID has amplified some of these effects. So pre-pandemic, women were doing about 75% of unpaid work globally. And globally, the average suggests that women spend between 3 and 6 hours a day on unpaid work. So that's anything sort of domestic. It's shopping, it's cooking, it's childcare, all those sort of administration tasks that sit around running a household. Men, on the other hand, range from 30 minutes to 2 hours pre-pandemic. So doing a little bit, but, you know, they're not going to die of exhaustion from it. Post-pandemic, we've seen a huge uplift in the amount of work that women are doing outside of their official work, so this unpaid domestic labour. And the data in the UK suggests that women during the pandemic, when there was homeschooling and children were all at home, were doing more than 60% of the additional childcare. So if that child was suddenly at home for 5-6 hours a day where they weren't previously, women were taking up way more than half of that extra work. And again, through the pandemic, we've seen the impact of some of these political decisions. There is evidence that women are more likely to be furloughed than men. They're the red line at the top here. And that some of these gaps got bigger when, for example, schools closed or lockdowns were implemented. So those always impacted women more than they did men. And, you know, there are other implications to this. So this is a piece of evidence about the impact of school closures on women's availability to participate in the corridors of power. So this data looks at expert witnesses speaking at House of Commons committee meetings. So these would be people who are industry experts brought in to advise politicians or to give their perspective to politicians. As you can see from October 2020, women were already underrepresented at that point. By February 2021, women's participation in these committees has gone down even further, whereas men stays absolutely stable at 127. So what we can take from this is that the lockdown and the closure of schools really had very little impact on those men who were going to be called to come and give advice, but it had a significant impact on women who were unable to do that. And even without the pandemic, they were underrepresented in those forums. And this is, you know, these are the rooms where decisions get made, and these are the rooms where women are struggling to find the time and the desire on the part of the corridors of power to invite them into those rooms. So it's all feeling quite familiar. If you've read The Handmaid's Tale, you'll know that how women were in that novel are forced back into the home, forced back into domestic roles. And I think we're seeing some elements of that. And without wishing to scaremonger and, you know, focus on the dystopian, because we've had a lot of dystopia in the past year, wherever we are in the world, I think we need to be really mindful of the progress of some of these statistics around furlough and around women's access to the corridors of power, because there's a line in The Handmaid's Tale where Offred says, "It's like being in a gradually heating up bathtub. We didn't realise how much our rights were getting eroded until it was too late." And I really, really strongly want to emphasise this is happening now, and we need to be tracking this now, and we need to be thinking about how we can fight this now. So there's lots and lots of impacts on being a woman in the workplace that we've seen. Whether you have children or not, you're likely to be affected by that. So when we net up all of those different impacts, what do we see in terms of women's professional earnings? Well, what we see is that on average, women in the UK are going to earn over $250,000 less in the course of their careers than men. So, you know, think about that in practical terms. $250,000 might be the cost of a small house, or it might be the fees for childcare for several years for your children, plus hopefully a lot extra at the end of that. So this impact is really real. And I think any of us on this call, if someone said to us, "Hey, here's another £250,000 over the course of your career," we'd snap it up, right? And that's money that's being denied to us simply because we're women. And, you know, that has a couple of impacts. We know that women are less likely to hold investments than men. So when I say investments, I'm talking about pensions, but I'm also talking about investing in stocks and shares, ISAs, and that type of thing. Men are more likely than women to invest in long-term things like that, which will then pay off in their retirement. Now, there's a couple of things going on here. One is that women have less money. As we've seen on the previous slide, over the course of our lives, we're likely to be earning less. So there's less disposable income for them to be able to think about investments. But there's also very little support for female investors in the UK. This may be different in other countries, but I've seen it very much in the UK. It feels like a very male field. It's quite hard to understand the information. It's quite difficult to see what investments are. ones that you might be comfortable investing in. A lot of the literature is about returns, but women tend to invest on more kind of ethical and values-based sort of criteria. So we'll be looking for businesses that give us a return, but also that we think are doing some good. And there's very little support for that type of investment at the moment. So here we are with our 250,000 less than men and our reduced investments. What's the result of all of those things? Well, this is the result. This is a graph of Europe which shows the pension pay gap across Europe, and it comes out a little bit small on the side, but what you'll see is all these countries that are kind of reddy pink, so the UK, France, Spain, Sweden, all of these countries have a pension pay gap of between 30 to 40%. So as you and your husband retire, if you're a heterosexual couple, you will find that your husband will have rather more disposable income than you do for all of the reasons that we've just talked about. And of course, you're going to live longer. So that's going to be a problem that you continue to face potentially long after your husband may have passed on. So this is not an issue that goes away at any point in women's lives. The pay gap begins almost immediately in many, many cases, and it just increases and increases. And our lack of money to invest and our lack of confidence in investing positively increases that gap, such that by the time we retire, we're looking at these really significant gaps. So, it's not a problem that you can think, well, I'm heading for retirement, I won't worry about that too much anymore. It's really something that happens from the day we walk into our first job right through to the end of our lives. Okay, so let's be honest, there's a lot of bad news in there. I share that because I think it's really important to be clear-eyed about these impacts and to look at the data and to interrogate it and to understand it so that you're aware of it and you can then take positive decisions to do something about it. So here's my call to action. I always have a call to action in my conference papers because the work that I do is not just work, it's about society, it's about the world. And every one of us has the ability to take some action in this regard. Never underestimate the power of individual accountability. So the first thing I would say is that pay transparency works. There's lots and lots of data about this. The more that companies are transparent about their pay structures and who gets paid what, the more likely we are to see the gender pay gap equalise. And I use the example of the social media company Buffer, who some of you may know. It's a kind of social media scheduling tool. And they use a formula that factors in all of these things that many other companies use as excuses for differences in pay. So they look at the job title, they look at experience, they also look at the cost of living. So if they expect people to live in a high-cost city like San Francisco, they factor that into the salaries as well. So they have this formula and they calculate the salary based on this. So it's not at all based on are you a man or are you a woman? It's based on where do you need to live? Do you have the experience? And this is what the job is worth. And they don't have a pay gap between men and women in the same role. So they absolutely use this formula to take out all of that bias and all of those kind of excuses and to say, this is what the job is worth, this is what we'll pay for it. And they share this formula on their website. You can go in and calculate what your salary could be before you apply for a role there. The other thing to say about this is often companies will say to me, we worry if we're transparent about our pay, people might not apply to work for us. The interesting thing about Buffer is when they published all of this data for the first time, so they were a startup, then they reached a point where they thought they needed to start looking at this data more comprehensively. They published it for the first time and they had something like a threefold increase in applications for roles. So I would argue that what's going on there is that people are saying, hey, this company seems to be taking fairness really seriously. They're not just talking about diversity and inclusion and equity. They're actually putting their money where their mouth is and proving that that's part of their DNA. That's the company I want to belong to. Those are some values I can support. So something to consider. And, in a more sort of, experimental context, pay transparency has been shown to work as well. So there's a piece of research that was a joint project between Cornell and Tel Aviv universities, where they took participants into a kind of game. And and they gave them bonuses based on their performance in that game. So with some of the participants, they told them what that pay structure was going to be and what the potential bonuses were. With other participants, they didn't tell them. They said there's some pay and there are some bonuses, but they weren't transparent about the actual, figures underlying that. And what they found as these participants then went off to play the game and try to win these bonuses was that those who were kept in the dark performed worse than those who were informed. So the people who knew what the pay structure was were just, able to focus and get on with doing the task and were more successful in delivering that task. The people who weren't informed about the pay scales and the bonuses available in financial terms, some of their cognitive energy was taken up with thinking about that. So they performed worse in those experiments. So pay transparency works. It relieves cognitive load off people worrying about whether they're being paid the same or feeling stressed about the fact they're maybe not being paid as much as their male colleagues, for example. So if you're in an organization, talk to your employers about pay transparency, challenge them about why they're not transparent about pay, what are the secrets they're trying to hide there, and show them this evidence which says, if you pay people fairly and you're transparent about it, we will perform better, the company will be more attractive to new employees. These are real benefits for companies. It's not the reason they should be doing it. They should be doing it because it's the right thing, but we don't live in a perfect world. So show this data and get them into a discussion about why they refuse to be transparent. And what else can you do? There's lots and lots of things you can do. And I'm a big advocate of the ripple effect. One person doing one thing differently starts other people thinking, maybe I can do that differently. And that ripple effect is real. So talk about your salary is the first thing you can do. Get the men in your life to talk about their salary at work. I read an article recently about a woman who'd said that she was going for a promotion at work. She wasn't sure how to pitch the salary, how to handle the negotiation, and what level to request a salary. And one of her male colleagues shared his salary with her, talked about how he justified his arguments for getting that salary, and helped her to prepare for that conversation. And she was successful in getting a salary on parity with him. If she'd not done that piece of work, she probably would have undervalued herself. She probably would have handled the negotiation differently, and she probably wouldn't have had that outcome. So men have a role in allying here as well and helping women to get to that pay parity. Second thing you can do is invest. Consider investing in businesses whose values you support. Consider investing in female-founded businesses because, as we saw back at the start, they're less likely to get access to funding in the normal scenarios. And there are lots of ways to do this. There are apps like Plum, where you can just round up all your transactions and they take those pennies out of your account and you can then invest them. You could speak to a financial advisor if you have the money to do that. But think about those long-term investments that women are not typically taking up, because you are going to get to the end of your career and you're going to need a serious pot of money, particularly as lives get longer. So think about where you can invest. It doesn't have to be hundreds of thousands of pounds. It can be pennies. And, you can do good with that as well. My mother invests her money in micro businesses in Asia to support them in buying, a sewing machine so they can start their own business, for example. So, she doesn't actually take the return on that money, but you can if you want to. So you can invest and do good. Investing does not mean you're necessarily funding things you disagree with. You just have to be thinking creatively about where you invest. Thirdly, educate yourself. As I say, I've talked a lot about the UK here, where we have some legislation around gender pay, although I would caveat that with saying it's really not been enforced and there's been no financial penalty for failing to report. But educate yourself about your region, educate yourself about the pay gap, read up on the legislation, because paying men and women different salaries to do the same role is illegal in many parts of the world, but it's very, very rarely proved and prosecuted. But we could do that. We could have more recourse to the law. It takes courage and it takes time. But if you're in that position, you may want to understand the legislation and what your options are. And there are charities and legal firms that will support women in taking these kinds of cases up. So do your Googling, do your research, educate yourself. Don't allow this to happen to you by default, just because you're not aware of the issues. And finally, be an ally. Open doors for others. So, you know, I'm talking about women very generically here, but of course we know that as a white woman, I'm going to have privileges that don't apply to black women, for example. And the research tells us that what has the most impact is openly advocating for people whose voices are not in the room. So if you're lucky enough to get into a boardroom or a senior management role or into the corridors of power in terms of politics or finance, whose voices are missing there? Which women don't you see represented? And can you open doors for them? Can you advocate for their contribution and get them in that room? Because that's how we're going to change the dynamic of business. And that's how we're going to really address these issues in the long term. So that was it from me, a whistle-stop tour of gender pay gaps, hopefully some things to provoke some thoughts for you. Again, apologies for some of the caveats around the data and focusing in particular on the UK. As I say, in the interest of time, I was trying to give a bit of direction to the talk. But as I say, there'll be information out there that you need to find if you're outside the UK. Do your Googling, do your research, find out who's active in this area, follow them on social media, and find out what you can do to support their efforts to equalise gender pay. These impacts are real, and I would like, if anyone goes away from this talk and thinks I need to do something about my financial planning, then that's a good result. If anyone goes away from this talk and says, I'm going to find out why we don't have pay transparency in my organisation, that's a good result. Every one of us can make a difference here. So take what you've heard today, by all means get angry. You should be angry, it's not fair. But then get even. Here's my details. I'd love to connect with you on social media. I hope you've enjoyed this brief presentation and I look forward to the Q&A. Bye now.